What's up, everybody? This is another bonus edition of Sit Down, Shut Up, Mark Out. So happy to be with you all this week because we are on a bit of a break. It's the first break we've ever taken, but I couldn't leave you with nothing. In fact, I have something far better than nothing. It's better than nothing. It's my guest, a very big something, in fact. And that is Dr. David M. Reiss, back in the house, rejoining us. Hello, sir. How are you?
Fine. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I got to tell you, we got some great feedback about your first visit to the show, and I had to have you back. I'm going to have you back as much as you'll come back because I'm just fascinated by what you know, what you've done to assist in awareness about mental health and concussions in wrestling and in sports and in humanity. You know, it's a very, very misunderstood thing. I certainly have misconceptions about it that I'm hoping to learn more about. And, you know, you have some really awesome wrestling stories to tell, which we will focus on, not in this episode, though. This episode, we are talking about concussions. I want people to understand them better. I want people to empathize with what people go through a little more, because I think, you know, look, in the social media landscape, we are so removed and yet we are so close. And so I think we feel close enough to make a lot of assumptions that are actually very misguided. Okay. And so it's great to have you here. You're a clarifying presence, and I really appreciate that. If you're not familiar with Dr. David M. Reiss, he was my guest on Sit Down, Shut Up, Mark Out a few weeks back, and we had a fantastic conversation that I highly recommend. You pause this episode, go listen to that episode, and then come back. But now that you're unpaused, we're back. So what's new in your world, Dr. Reiss? What's going on with Dr. Dave?
Well, keeping pretty busy. I mean, I say I'm semi-retired. That means I've cut down from like 60 hours a week to 30 hours a week.
Oh, taking it easy these days, huh?
Still not really time to write and do the things I want to do. Keeping pretty busy on a lot of fronts, mostly clinically. Yeah.
Okay. And you said that you taped a presentation this last week, right?
Actually, I've worked with the Concussion Foundation out of Boston, Chris Nowinski, for over a dozen years. Mm-hmm. And that's evolved because they started out as a research organization, but they had so many calls of people looking for practical help that we now have a helpline, and that's where I now do most of my work, is actually with the helpline and providing assistance, getting people referrals, as opposed to just standing on the sidelines and learning from them, which is what I probably did the first 10 years. We taped our presentation that's for medical professionals on understanding concussions and the complexity. And again, I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a neuropsychologist, I'm a psychiatrist, but the complexity of what we see in people after a concussion and how difficult it is to, one, figure out what's going on exactly, two, to treat it, but with confidence that while there's a lot we don't know, there are a lot of things we now know aren't true that we used to think are true.
Sure.
And that actually is a big advance, even though there's still a lot of questions.
So you're telling me it's a little more scientific than just ringing your bell and just getting back in the game?
You know, and if I told the story before, just stop me. My first exposure was in medical school when I did a clerkship with the Northwestern football team. And that was a season of 77, so it goes back a couple of years.
Yeah,
and in those days, a couple of decades.
Whatever.
What's a few decades about?
Yeah, whatever, you know.
But very seriously, in those days, if someone went down on the field, you went out, checked to make sure they were alive. That's usually a good place to start. But then, very seriously, we asked two questions. How many fingers do I have up? And you put up 2 or 3. And are we going to the right or are we going to the left? if they answered those questions, even if they answered them slowly and a little foggy, they stayed in the game. We didn't even take them out, let alone do. I mean, maybe we did more of an evaluation afterwards, but it was considered okay, basically intact. And we now know that was horrible, but it was the best we knew.
And that is the essence of medical knowledge, right? We used to treat people with leeches and all kinds of stuff because we thought that worked.
Yeah.
And so, it's said with no judgment whatsoever. We just know so much more now.
Yeah.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. Hopefully that continues because we're always learning more as long as we're allowed to get the data to put it together. But then there can be different interpretations of data in good faith and honestly. Sure, there are some bad actors here and there, but even totally legitimate data can be interpreted in different ways. And we're always learning more. If you're not learning, you're dying.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and science is slow. It's not something, because legitimate science, unlike somebody going on TV and saying we'll know the cure for autism by September, genuine science is done painstakingly. It's not done with an agenda. It's done with proving failure over and over and over again until something is determined to be fail-proof and actually true, right? Objectively true.
Yeah, there's that old story that is attributed to Edison. I don't know if it really was, where when he developed the light bulb and someone said, don't you regret having spent like 6 years testing substances that didn't work until you found tungsten? And he said, no, I now have 10,000 substances that I know won't make good light bulbs. And there's nothing serious to that. And we are always learning. And the other thing that I'll just add is it's not linear. It's not like each year we grow a little bit more. There's some things that we gather more data and grow linear, but also as there are more developments, whether it be X-rays, CAT scans, the oxygen scans, that sometimes there are leaps and bounds, but then sometimes those leaps turn out not to be as valid as we hoped they would be. So it's very much a uneven progress and a back and forth, and that's the nature of the beast. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. That means you're doing it right.
There's this kind of delusional thinking sometimes in America, especially, where it's like only up, always up, always up. And that's not how science works. There's, when we tell the truth, it's done gradually. It's through recognizing mistakes. It's through regathering the information and figuring out where we went wrong. And that's how we progress and grow.
I can give you one very specific example of that relates directly to concussions. Like I said, back initially, it was like get right back on the field. Then we went through many years, and I won't put numbers on it, where it was like if you had a concussion, don't do anything for a couple of weeks. Stay in bed, keep the lights off, keep the sound off. And we really thought that helped the brain heal. The current data shows that, no, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to overstimulate, but neither do you want to hibernate. Actually having a reasonable amount of stimulation, not getting back on the field, but in terms of active, using your cognition is actually helpful. So the recommendations, and we're talking about maybe 5 to 10 years ago that would have been made, we now recommend something completely opposite.
Yeah, because I heard a story about a football player who had terrible history of concussions and retired and spent most of his time in a dark room not doing anything.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're saying that's not the right way to go either. We know that now. We didn't know that then.
Right. And for some symptoms that may be more, for some people that may be more comfortable because of their particular symptomatology, but that used to be the general recommendation. And we now have data that says, no, that actually gets in the way of the brain healing. Again, you don't want to overstimulate, but you want sufficient stimulation to be able to heal, not just to hide away.
Right. Okay. Okay. So for the listener right now, the dynamic here is that I'm speaking with a man who really knows his shit, and I am the layman, okay? And so we're going to pull back about 10,000 feet and talk about how I and vis-a-vis maybe the general public, maybe I'm a little more informed than the average person, but not much more. So, until the 2000s, to the general populace, it felt like concussions didn't seem to be treated super seriously. Like we knew that they existed, but we didn't see it as like a serious impediment to very much. I've heard, like you just outlined, many stories of the quarterback who got their bell rung. Maybe by the 90s, we knew to take him out for a few plays, and then we put him back in the game.
Yeah. For a long time, if someone was symptomatic, obviously you took them out.
Right.
But we didn't realize that even if someone did not experience a lot of symptoms, you still don't want to risk another blow to the head proximate to the first one. So you need a time period to just be away from that risk, to be away from the risk.
And then in the pro wrestling context, in the 90s and early to mid 2000s, I think were perhaps the most reckless time of all, which is the formative time of me watching wrestling, right? Yeah. ECW made the unprotected chair shot a very common occurrence. Yeah. And in Japan, specifically like all Japan wrestling, wrestlers like Misawa, Kobashi, and Kawada just, normalized dropping an opponent on their neck or head, which... fans, of course, thought was awesome looking, and it was, because it was insanely reckless, and there's no way to sell that. It's just, you got dropped on your fucking head. Yeah. And then in the 2000s, I do remember there was kind of a proliferation of former NFL players like Junior Seau or Aaron Hernandez, who were found to start, these were, in the case of Junior Seau, he's a pitch man. He was very popular football personality who kind of went off the rails very suddenly and started acting very recklessly. And he took his life and he died by suicide. And he specifically did it in a way that would leave his brain available to do research on later. And it was found that he had significant CTE. And then Aaron Hernandez, a man who was in jail for murder, while he was making millions as a player on the Patriots, was found to have advanced CTE in his 20s. Yeah. So that's the time that maybe CTE and concussion research was starting to come onto my radar. And then, unfortunately, we had the terrible happenings of the Chris Benoit murder-suicide. And Chris's brain was researched, I believe, by the Concussion Legacy Foundation. Yeah. And Chris Nowinski was on every news show for months that I saw talking about this very thing. And he was found to have the brain of like somebody in their 70s or 80s. And he was, I believe, in his late 30s or early 40s.
Yeah. Yeah. And this isn't from any personal clinical contact, but I'm in San Diego. I've been in San Diego 40 years. So I had season tickets when Junior was playing, and actually we crossed paths a number of times, not clinically, just we'd be at the same fundraisers, things like that. And it actually wasn't sudden, and I didn't know him well by any means. I just met him a couple times, so I didn't really see it, but I knew people who knew him, that there was really a slow deterioration, but people hide it and people around them hide it. He had, and again, this is from the news, this isn't from any personal information. He had a car accident, I think it was a year or two before he committed suicide. Right. Now, I know that road. And yes, it's dangerous. And yes, if you're not watching, but there is, in retrospect, no doubt that was a suicide attempt. But for whatever reasons, and I have no idea who was responsible or not, I have no idea whether his doctors saw it as such, but it truly wasn't put out as a suicide attempt. It was put out as an accident. But And that was a good year or two before he actually killed himself.
Yeah, I believe it was about a year before, because I remember reading about it. And I mean, it was a really scary accident.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
didn't he go off a cliff or something? I mean,
Yeah, it's a road that is on goes down to a reservoir, so it's a steep hillside. So if you go off the shoulder, you're in trouble.
right. Okay. Okay. And then, yes. And then after surviving a really horrific situation like that, he took his life about a year later.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so that I think is what started to bring concussion research and CTE to the forefront of the public consciousness, right? And wrestling got called to the carpet by Congress. I believe John McCain was one of the leading voices on that, and they demanded that Vince McMahon implement some kind of protocols for these things, because the Benoit murders were so horrific. And it was obvious that Chris Benoit was in such terrible condition that it was just simply inhumane to allow somebody to treat themselves so badly.
One of the problems that we've had, and there have been multiple problems, but one of the problems is that unless a concussion is severe, really in the realm of a severe TBI, traumatic brain injury, it's not going to show up on an X-ray. It's not going to show up even on a CAT scan or an EEG. We're now finding some tests that may be able to detect it, both in terms of different ways of imaging that may be able to detect it, as well as markers in the blood that are indicative of basically inflammatory response in the brain. None of that science is totally there yet. It's certainly a lot more than we used to know. But because of that, it was very easy to write it off. Because, okay, he had a CT, he had an MRI, nothing shows up. So is this imaginary? Is this just personality? We now know, no, things are going on in the brain that we cannot yet detect. We're getting better at it. And you can see the results, but the results are different in every different person.
Okay.
And part of that's physiological, part of it's psychological, part of it is basically because the brain is such a complex system, it just has a randomness all of its own.
Right. So you led me perfectly into this question. What is a concussion?
That's basically the place to start, obviously. And very seriously, the definition of concussion has changed markedly over the years. When I was in med school, a concussion was a blow to the head that caused the loss of consciousness. If there was no loss of consciousness, you could still have a blow to the head that caused some symptoms, but it wasn't considered a concussion.
Wow.
Now it's totally different. It doesn't even have to be a blow to the head. All it has to be, well, let me just back up for a second. The brain is within the skull and is basically, in a sense, sitting in a bath of liquid.
Right.
And if the head moves suddenly, the brain sloshes back and forth. The damage may not even be from the blow to the head, but from the brain hitting the skull while it's. So we now know that a concussion is basically any force to the head that causes the brain to move within the skull. And it may be minimal symptoms, it may be severe symptoms, there may be cumulative symptoms, but we now define concussion as anything that causes the brain to move, that there might be micro damage that isn't going to show up on scans, but that may heal or may progress, depending on the part of the brain, depending on how frequently, and also depending on the age of the person. But we now define concussion as anything that causes the brain to move around within the head.
There we go. Okay. So I want you to, the person listening to this in your car, in your headphones, at work, whatever, you are a being walking around, and in your head is a bath, basically, of chemicals that your brain is floating around in to some degree.
Cerebral spinal fluid, to be technical.
Absolutely. There we go. Cerebral spinal fluid. That always weirds me out to think about. But when you see a football game or you see a wrestling match and you see somebody, let's say, for instance, just take the simplest vertical suplex, okay? How much do you think the brain is moving in that one coordinated movement? And how easy would it be for it to smack against your skull?
Right.
Okay? A concussion can happen simply from that, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
So,
And actually, if we go to football, basically every play, the linemen are having stresses on their head that are the equivalent of a 30-mile-an-hour collision in a car.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean it's all causing concussions, because it depends the angle, it depends how someone's protecting themselves, and there are other. But every play, you're having enough force on each lineman who's making contact, equivalent to a 30-mile-an-hour collision.
Right. And so theoretically, then, a helmet is protecting you from exterior damage, the way you'd protect yourself from a gunshot or something. But it can't keep your brain from moving around in your head.
Right.
There are padding and stuff like that they're wearing to keep their spine straight to a relative degree, to keep maybe your brain from moving around. But functionally, folks, collisions, trauma, it can be caused from a variety of factors, but it can be as simple as your brain smacking against your skull.
Yeah.
So,
and we're talking about, obviously, sports is what we're focusing on, but this is any TBI, any head injury, and many different sports. But the other place where it's often neglected is domestic violence, where, women's getting maybe not terribly, quote unquote, beat up, but what are the doctors looking at? They're looking at the bruises. They're looking at any fractures. They're often not saying, did you see stars? And even the therapists are looking at, how do you get out of this toxic relationship, as opposed to what's going on cognitively.
Right.
So we know a lot more, and across the board, basically every sport, obviously wrestling, football, hockey, but even, and I think I may have said this before, baseball, where it's mostly the catchers, because they're the ones who have the collisions at home plate.
Right. Of course. Yeah. And soccer, all kinds of anything that requires, physical contact over a sustained period of time with the potential for collision is dangerous. It's not just something they say to protect themselves legally. It is dangerous.
Right. And the other thing I'll just add with that, and this is something that we've realized relatively recently, is it's not just the big hit in the game, it includes practice. And in football, obviously, or wrestling practice, you're taking bumps, you're getting hits. But we're talking about, I've seen 16-year-old women who are having problems from practicing heading the ball in soccer.
Wow.
Just to repair, in fact, that's one of the things the Concussion Foundation has been pushing, is no heading under 16.
Oh, okay.
And that's a whole nother issue if you'd like to get
yeah,
into it.
Of course.
David. And that's that, the brain is still developing in young people, which makes it more vulnerable.
Right.
And not the same vulnerability in every person. But it's more vulnerable to damage. It's more vulnerable to the damage causing long-term problems. And it's also more vulnerable to repetitive damage causing more cumulative damage than someone who's, let's say, 30.
Okay.
So there are a lot of moving parts, literally.
Well, and so kind of what I'm hearing is, yes, it can be your brain smacking against your skull. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be a traumatic brain injury. And just because you do sustain some kind of head collision doesn't mean you will get a concussion, because so there's a million variables that go into this.
Right.
And
because sometimes you'll see a huge hit, but if the angle was such that the brain just didn't really twist, because it's really more the torque, the twist, that causes the micro shearing, which is what we think now. And again, I'm not a neurologist, as opposed to just the actual force. So sometimes it can look terrible, but there isn't that much of the twisting and shearing. Other times it could look relatively minor, but things are really moving with a large torque, and that causes more damage.
Very interesting. Okay. So we are cooking with gas, folks. We're going to take a quick musical break. Gerald, please. All right, and we are back. Okay. So Dr. Reiss, Dr. Dave, let's talk a little more about this helmet stuff.
This is something that's actually I have a bit more, not direct experience with in terms of working with helmets, but when I did an internship with the Northwestern football team, the team doctor had been the center of the Northwestern team that went to the Rose Bowl in 1935 and 1936.
Yeah.
And he was actually very aware of concussion issues for those days. And we're talking about, as I said, the season of 77. But we were focusing on helmets, and that's what he was focusing on, was working with various manufacturers to develop better helmets. We didn't realize that was protecting the skull, but not as much protecting the brain. Now there are some newer helmets that try to actually protect the brain and protect the movement in a different way. Than, obviously we have a lot more technology. I think the science surely isn't quite there yet, and this isn't my area of specialty to know. Hopefully we will have more development so that helmets will be more protective. But what we used to think, and where we were looking at research for helmets all through, let's say, the 70s and 80s, was basically just protecting the skull and not really protecting the brain.
Right. Okay. And I think, I am I am nothing, but as it relates to technical know-how, but, it seems pretty hard to protect the brain entirely if you leave your feet in any kind of way, you seem like you're exposing your brain to some kind of risk. And these are not things I ever thought about as a young kid. I can only imagine the many times that I could have easily sustained a concussion and was lucky not to. Yeah. Looking back,
because obviously the force of the hit is important, but as we've talked about, considering that some of the most severe damage is due to the torque and the spin in the brain, it's much more difficult to appreciate.
Right. Okay, so we've kind of identified the basics of what a concussion is. What are some common symptoms of a concussion? I know everybody's different and it's not going to affect everyone the same way, but what are some very common, like you mentioned, stars, like seeing stars?
Everyone's different. It also obviously depends on what part of the brain is affected. The different parts of the brain will cause different symptoms. In general, yes, the seeing stars is because the optic nerve is very sensitive. So that's basically doesn't measure the damage, but says something's happened. And we now know that if you've seen stars, your brain has been affected. How seriously, it doesn't say, but it's been affected. Obviously, problems with memory, problems with concentration are very common. Sensitivity to light and sound are very common. But there are other issues. Some people get a lot of GI symptoms, nausea, vomiting, and not necessarily just because of a severe TBI. Sometimes that's part of the concussion, which leads us, and this is going a little bit further on, but stop me, into what we call post-concussive syndrome, and there are different names for it. And we now define that as symptoms that last more than 2 or 3 months. Okay. I say 2 or 3 because it is a wide range. I've seen people who have pretty severe symptoms for a month or 2 and then get totally better. At least they seem to. We don't know, not necessarily long term. But then there are other people where it may linger. There are people may be better in a day or 2. There are people may be better in a week. But if you're having the symptoms over 2 or 3 months, you've got something more serious going on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to progress to CTE, which we can talk about later, but it means that it's more serious and you're not ready to go back.
Right. Okay. I think anybody who's followed any sport or wrestling or anything has, there's a wrestler that is out for much longer than expected because they sustained something, concussion that maybe was more serious than your typical, they can pass the protocol in a few weeks or a month or something.
Right. And without going into any names or anything, I could say I've seen people who looked fine, but they were still having headaches or still having a little bit of blurry vision or still having nausea or light sensitive. It may appear totally differently, but it's still an indication that something isn't healed yet.
Okay. So with that said, is it true, because I've heard this before, is it true that getting a concussion makes you more susceptible to getting another concussion? Like, is it easier to repeat once you've had one?
Well, it doesn't make it more like, if we talk about concussion in terms of the actual incident, it doesn't make it more likely that it's going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it more likely that if it happens again, it's going to have worse effects.
I see.
It's going to have cumulative effects. So it doesn't make you more likely to have another concussion, but it makes it more likely that the second concussion is going to have greater, maybe more prolonged symptoms, maybe even different symptoms. And when you get to the third, fourth, fifth concussion, there does seem to be a cumulative effect. Now, not necessarily in everyone.
Right.
I mean, I've seen people, we talk about wrestling and people dropped on their heads. And I've seen people who've had more chair shots than I've sat on chairs who are absolutely fine.
Right.
On the other hand, I've seen people who, didn't think they even had a severe concussion at all. But I saw stars a number of times and have a sadly downhill course. And it may not even show up neurologically. It may show up psychologically in terms of depression, anxiety, impulsivity, loss of impulse control. And I'll just go a little bit further with that. The way a lot of people try to compensate is by focusing more, which is difficult, but they'll become more obsessive. Now, when you get to high levels of any profession, whether you're talking about sports, doctors, lawyers, it helps to be a bit obsessive.
Mm-hmm.
But when people start increasing their obsessionality to cover up where their cognition is falling, that can have problems in itself. That can lead into other cognitive as well as emotional difficulties and anger, frustration, depression, and they all play into each other in a vicious cycle a lot of the times.
I feel like I've heard Bryan Danielson talk about that to some degree because he is famously a guy who had to retire due to, neck issues, but also concussions and couldn't get cleared for a long time and kind of did some groundbreaking concussion therapy that eventually allowed him to return. But he talked about hiding concussions and that he had several seizures that he didn't tell anybody about. And it sounded like his symptoms did get progressively worse every time he had one. And I think he said he had 7 or 8 at that point. And, that's an incredible amount of damage to sustain. And of course, it would make sense that the more concussions you get, the worse the symptoms would get. But once you get to the point of having seizures, as somebody who's had exactly one seizure in my life, then I was later diagnosed with epilepsy in my 40s, actually.
Yeah.
And that's a terrifying experience to have a seizure when you've never had one before.
And there's also a complicating issue for some people. And actually, I have a relative, and this isn't sports related at all, that this happened, with developed a seizure disorder. We don't even know why.
Mm-hmm.
But having seizures coming out of nowhere, fell down any number of times, and had concussions from falling down with a seizure.
Of course, yeah.
So you get a really mixed, what the hell is doing what?
Oh my God, yeah, no, and they tell you now, they told me after I had one, I'm on a medication now to prevent myself from having one, and hopefully, God willing, I won't. It's been almost 3 years since I did, but they tell you the first thing if you start to leave your body a little bit is to lay down. And because
the
falling
last thing
is
you want to do is hit your head again.
right. Falling is the worst thing you
even
can
if
do.
the seizure disorder didn't start from a concussion, you can have secondary concussions, which then make it worse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So what I'm taking from concussions is that it's an extremely inexact science that we are still very much in the process of learning about, yet we have come so far from our fundamental understanding of concussions as recently as 15 or 20 years ago. And we still have so much left to learn about what causes this, because something I learned through my experience with concussions is I underwent a bunch of tests, and they told me, we're detecting something off in your brain, but the scans we do can only go so deep, and we still can't see certain activity in your brain. So it's not like we're living in some technological paradise where, we can diagnose absolutely anything. There's a million things we don't know.
Yeah. And even EEGs, which detect seizures, will only detect it if you're having a seizure at the time. Now, there are some forms of epilepsy that you can see are there even when someone isn't having a seizure. But there are some people who the EEG will be totally normal unless you catch it at the right time. Mm-hmm. That's why, and I assume they still do what they call sleep-deprived EEGs, where you go to a sleep lab, your brain waves are measured throughout the night, and you're kept awake, which makes your brain a little more vulnerable to try to catch what's going on that wouldn't be caught otherwise. But even that is not foolproof.
Right. And for me, what they said was we see slowing when you're in between wake and sleep states. And so we suspect, and I can't even remember the exact kind of epilepsy they called it, but it's, you're less prone to probably having a seizure, but the risk grows for people with this condition. I don't have, your typical level, typical risk factor for epilepsy or an epileptic seizure, but I do have a form of epilepsy suspected that, I couldn't drive for 6 months. And so, and that's with no concussion, that's with no concussion. And they can't see deep enough into my brain to know for sure that I even have it, but they treat me for it. And I've never had another one. So
that also, I don't know if you want me to go on a little bit.
Go ahead.
Just in a slightly different direction, because what you're saying now brings up another issue, which as a psychiatrist I'm dealing with all the time, is that having even a minor quote unquote concussion that causes, let's say, a 5 to 10% loss in cognitive abilities. Now, 5% you may not notice unless you're taking a test. 10%, that may change your view of yourself, may change your sense of identity, may interfere with working if someone isn't just a professional athlete. And then are you supporting your family in the same way? So you get all the psychosocial issues that compound it, as well as just the sense of identity of I'm not who I think I am. I'm not who I used to be. I'm not functioning. And then that in itself, that fear generates, particularly if someone has a history of trauma, and trigger a underlying PTSD, which complicates everything. And then a lot of the medications we would typically use for the anxiety and depression that causes actually cause subtle cognitive impairment. Now, your average and stop me if I'm going too far off with this.
No, not at all.
Your average person who, let's say, has a moderately severe depression, they don't need to be hospitalized, they're not suicidal, but they're significantly depressed. And if you give them therapy and medication, and maybe it causes a little bit of memory problem, they're going to see that as a quite fair trade-off for the depression getting better.
Sure.
On the other hand, someone who's there because of a concussion, they're going to notice that extra 5% because that may significantly deteriorate their functioning, and that may be from the medication they're using.
Right.
So we have to look at, is the medication helping one thing but making something else worse? And I won't even go into details, but especially these days, obviously weed is ubiquitous. It does help some of the symptoms. There are some chemicals in weed that actually help with inflammation and can help calm people. On the other hand, what's the most common thing that weed does? It interferes with memory.
Right.
So what am I treating? Am I treating the weed or am I treating the concussion?
Right, right. And so, once again, just an extraordinarily inexact science. Before we go, I do want to talk about CTE because that is, in my understanding, it is a disease, encephalitis. It's different than concussions, but are they related?
Yeah, chronic traumatic encephalitis. There's still a lot we don't know about it. We're learning more. And again, there are a lot of neurologists who know a hell of a lot more than I do.
Sure.
But the bottom line is that repetitive concussions, and when I say repetitive, you can be talking 2 or 3, you can be talking 50 or 100. We don't know exactly, and it's different in different people, can lead to a deterioration of the brain that's ongoing. And there are different theories. Is it due to inflammation? Is it due to plaque formation? What is exactly happening? We know more, but we don't know a lot. But it's so subtle in some ways that still, although we're getting close to having blood tests and other tests that can have it, it really cannot be officially diagnosed until autopsy.
Right.
By that time, it's a little too late to treat.
Yeah, a little too late when you're dead.
Funny, but, it also creates a lot of problems because I'll see any number of athletes who are very concerned that they're going in that direction. And sometimes we can see signs that, yeah, you probably are. Sometimes it's not clear. But that in itself creates anxiety, fear, stresses on relationships, etc. But CTE, we don't have a cure for. We're knowing more and more how to manage it, but it's still not there. But it is basically a progressive disorder that somehow arises from usually multiple concussions. We don't think it happens from one concussion, but we still don't know exactly why some people are more vulnerable than others.
Right. Okay. And how long have we actually known about CTE?
It depends if you're talking to a doctor or a lawyer. And I mean that, I'm using some dark humor here, but it's somewhat serious because we've known about it medically, or at least we suspected there's something going on. But obviously, lawyers representing certain entities wanted to say that doesn't happen. Still will say it doesn't happen, even though now there's good data that it happens and we have the autopsies, but we'll still minimize it. So our knowledge of that has fluctuated with both medical, political, and legal financial factors, unfortunately, coming into play that cloud the medical issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, America is such a groundbreaking country in so many ways. And what we've done with pioneering, research and things of that nature, but it feels like there is just the legal, financial clash with actual factual medical development that is always a factor. And I mean, you would know better than anyone, right? Like,
most of my practice actually for 30 years has been in the California workers' comp system.
Right.
And I'll see all sorts of stress claims, from harassment to physical stress after physical injuries. But I'll also see concussion issues. And I'm actually a member of the Sports Lawyers Association as an associate. I'm not a lawyer. But you'll see people arguing about it from different points of view. You'll see how things have changed. And it's very, very complex. And there's not only a lot we don't know, but there's something we don't want to know. I'll give you one. Now, this is the workers' comp case I just did recently. I won't say what sport the person was involved in, so no identifying information. But this was a professional athlete who had a number of concussions and who is very concerned that he's heading that direction. And when I evaluated him, not as a neurologist, I saw some signs that were worrisome. Now, does that mean he has it? By no means. But I can understand why this guy is, in non-clinical language, scared shitless.
Right.
And how does that affect him? And then how does that affect memory and concentration if you're always dealing with that underlying fear of where am I going to be in 10 years?
Mm-hmm. Of course. Yeah. I think that people don't always consider an athlete, their perspective, right? They're brought up to succeed at this one thing, and to basically they live 80% of their life in the first half of their life, if they're lucky, right?
Right.
And they got to make almost all their money in that part of their life, so that with the hope that they'll be able to pay for all the medical treatments and all the shit they're going to need to be healthy as older people, and maybe take care of the people around them or their friends or whatever, right?
And even those who don't make the pros may have had a high school or college career that gets lost to their medical records because they've gone on to do something totally different, but that's simmering in the background because of what they saw, what they experienced in high school.
Right.
Or maybe they played 1 year in college and then just didn't cut it enough, not only not to get to the pros, they may not even gotten to varsity, but that doesn't mean, not only does it not mean they didn't get concussions, but it's the weaker players who are going to be more prone to get hit harder.
Right.
Because they don't have the skills to defend themselves as well.
Right.
So there are a lot of people walking around who never even made it to the pros who are dealing with these issues without even necessarily knowing it.
Wow. Well, Dr. David M. Reiss, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you making the time to inform our audience about concussions, about brain trauma, about CTE, and these issues that, there's tons of research about, there's tons of articles about it, but I still feel like there's fundamental questions that haven't been answered, obviously, and some of which you have answered for me, and some of which the answer is we just don't know.
Yeah, and as basically everyone I work with clinically, I say, I can tell you much more that I've learned what I shouldn't do than I've learned what I should do.
And sometimes that's what will lead you to an answer,
And it's protective. I mean, I know some of the things we did before that we thought were helpful were making things worse. Thankfully, we're not doing that anymore.
Of course. Well, Dr. Reiss, thank you so much. This has been a very special edition of Sit Down, Shut Up, Mark Out. We will be back with Dr. Reiss, and next time we're talking just wrestling stories, folks. So hang on to your butts. We will be back very soon. But until then, I'm Blade Daly, and I will talk to you later.